Let's look at things that happened in the decade starting with the year 1800. Here I have a picture of the first three presidents of the United States, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. And as we look at this decade, it could be especially interesting to consider what are some of the political ideas that were common and popular at this point in time that would be considered rather unusual today. So for example, today, if someone came from a poor background and they worked really hard to earn their money, that could be considered a good thing. But at this point in history, that would have been considered more of an insult because there was this wealthy class of men who was from an elite class, born from good families that inherited their wealth and didn't have to work. And they thought that they were better than the people that had to work to earn their money. In fact, they used the term middling. Someone from a middling class of person was someone who earned a fair amount of money, but they did it because they had to work. And if you were a middling person who worked hard to earn your money, that was not quite as good as if you were from the elite class that was born into wealth and could devote your time to education and public service. And the idea was that the people from this elite class had the appropriate education and life experience and background that they needed to run a government, and that other lesser people wouldn't really be qualified to make sound political judgment or sound political decisions. This is somewhat of where, for example, the idea of the Electoral College comes from. The idea was that the common person wouldn't have the skills or the knowledge to be able to make political judgments and wouldn't be able to make judgments about laws or who should be president. And so the idea was that the common person could vote for representatives to go to government, but those representatives would come from that elite class, and then people from that elite class with the qualifications to make sound judgments would be the people that actually make decisions about laws and who should be president and things like that. And another thing that was interesting about this point in time is that political parties were considered a bad thing. If you accuse someone of belonging to a political party, that would have been considered kind of an insult. The idea was that we should all be part of this one big happy nation family, and we should not have divisions among ourselves into political parties. So calling someone to be a member of a political party was a bad thing. Also, the idea that goes along with the idea that the people that should be in government should be from this elite class, and it was the idea that they should do it out of devotion for public service because they're committed to their country and because they're called and they're asked to come and step forward and serve their country by being involved in politics, that they step forward and do so. And therefore, you wouldn't do it out of self-interest. And so campaigning would be a bad thing. So initially, the idea of someone campaigning and saying, I want to be president or I want to be senator, vote for me, and here's why you should vote for me, that would have been considered very, very terrible for someone to be so self-centered, to kind of have that self-aggrandizement point of view where you're campaigning for an office. So the idea was there shouldn't be political parties and people don't campaign. It's rather you get called and you accept the calling, but you don't actively campaign for your political position. Now, of course, very quickly, political parties did develop. And probably the first two political parties were the Federalist Party that we already talked about before. These were the people that were in favor of the Constitution, and they wanted a very strong federal government. And the first two presidents, Washington and Adams, could be called Federalists. And but then in the year 1801, Thomas Jefferson was elected to be president, and it was a shift from the Federalist Party to what was called the Republican Party. Now, the original Republican Party that Jefferson was a part of is different from today's Republican Party. They're two totally different parties. In fact, Jefferson's party is sometimes called the Republican Democrats. So the Federalists, they wanted a strong federal government, where the Republicans wanted a weaker federal government. Some of the issues were, for example, the Federalists favored strong ties to England, whereas Republicans favored strong ties to France. They liked the fact that France had their own revolution and supported us in our revolution, although France didn't last as a republic long and became when Napoleon took over. And some other issues, for example, the Federalists favored having a strong federal bank. They wanted the country to have a national bank that allowed us to raise money, and so that we could have bonds and make loans from the National Federal Bank, whereas the Republicans were opposed to our country having a national bank, and they didn't want our government going into debt. They didn't want our government issuing bonds because they were opposed to the bank and they were opposed to bonds. And then one of the more interesting controversies that we might not have imagined, but the Federalists thought that we should have a military, whereas Republicans thought that we should not have a standing military. They thought that if we have a standing military, that just leads to corruption. They eventually take power and they start exploiting people, and so we should not have a military. They think, look what happened with England. They had a military and they ended up controlling the colonies, and that's part of what the revolution was all about, trying to break free from that kind of tyranny. And so to do that, we need to make sure that our country does not have a military. So the Republicans, they would have said that states can have militia to defend themselves, but the federal national government should not have a standing military. At least that was the platform of the Republican Party at that point. So anyway, so the year 1801 is when Jefferson becomes elected president, and there's a shift from the Federalist Party to the Republican Party in terms of political power. And we know a lot of what Thomas Jefferson thought about black people because during the Revolutionary War, he wrote a paper called Notes on the State of Virginia, in which he described his viewpoints of black people. And in this paper, he wrote that compared to white people, he said that black people were intellectually inferior, lacking bravery, more adventuresome, lacking in forethought, and insensitive to pain. And that makes sense that a lot of times slave owners who inflicted harsh physical punishment on their slaves, who whipped their slaves, often thought their slaves were insensitive to pain, which made them feel better. You could feel better about whipping someone and inflicting pain on someone if you think, well, they're probably not sensitive. They're probably not as sensitive to pain as I am. And so that probably allowed slave owners to feel better about themselves by thinking their slaves were insensitive to pain. Thomas Jefferson also thought that slaves required less sleep, but they sleep more compared to white people, except when they stay up late distracted by trivial amusements. So certainly Thomas Jefferson had a very negative viewpoint of black people. And it was probably the common viewpoint that most white people, and certainly white slave owners had about black people at this time in history. And like most slave owners, Thomas Jefferson had slaves that would try to escape if they ever could. And so here I have a picture of an ad that was posted by Thomas Jefferson where he requests help to capture a slave that escaped. So this ad describes what the slave looks like. He mentioned that the slave was trained as a shoemaker and has tools and might try to seek employment as a shoemaker. And he offers a reward for anyone who is able to capture and return this escaped slave. And here is a current picture of Thomas Jefferson's mansion on his Monticello plantation. And in talking about Thomas Jefferson and slavery, it's important also to consider Sally Hemings, because she pertains to a part of slavery that's sometimes not talked about. But it was very, very common for white male slave owners to sexually assault their female slaves. If you think about it, it probably is not surprising that if a man thinks he owns his female slave and can do whatever he wants with her, it's probably not surprising that he would sexually assault her and rape her. And if you look at the advertisements that people made when they were selling women slaves, sometimes those advertisements made their female slaves sound like people it would be okay to sexually assault. And white men often talked about black women in sexual terms. So before Thomas Jefferson became president, he spent some time as an ambassador in France. And his wife, Martha, actually died in 1782. And it was 1787. He was in Paris, France, after his wife died. And he had Sally Hemings come live with him. And Sally Hemings was one of his slaves. She was actually the daughter of a relationship between Jefferson's father-in-law and one of his slaves. and Sally was the daughter from that relationship. And so Jefferson had Sally come to live with him in Paris when he was an ambassador to France. And at that point, Sally Hemings would have been 14 years old, and Jefferson would have been 44 years old. And over the course of her life, Sally would have from between 5 to 7 children who were fathered by Thomas Jefferson. It's not clear exactly when he started assaulting her, but she had at least one child by the time she was 16, because she had a child when she was 16, and that was when Jefferson was planning to leave France, and she was trying to figure out a way to stay in France and not be his slave anymore. And part of what happened is that Jefferson made an agreement that if she returned to the United States with him, he would free all of her children when they became adults. And Jefferson actually did do that, that all of Sally Hemings' children that he had with her, which he fathered children with her, and they became his slaves initially. And this was actually a very common thing for white men to rape their slave, and that slave has a child, and the child is actually the master's son or daughter, but that child becomes a slave and is treated just like all the other slaves. Although Jefferson did free Sally Hemings' children that he fathered with her, when those children reached adulthood, he did free those children. Notably, he did not free any other slaves, but he did free the slaves that were actually his children, fathered with Sally Hemings. The beginning of the 1800s seems like an especially violent time in the United States. And this includes not only the violence that white people used to dominate their slaves, but also violence between white men. And fighting and physical violence were especially common in the South. It would not have been uncommon to hear of someone being beaten with a cane or having their eye gouged out in a fight. It was part of a culture that believed men needed to protect their honor, and if someone insulted your honor, men were expected to fight. I'm not sure. Some people have wondered if the presence of slavery contributed to this, if maybe the presence of slavery made it so that men felt an increased need to establish their superiority, or maybe it led to an increased acceptance of violence. Either way, this was certainly part of the culture, and part of protecting your honor involved the practice of dueling. And dueling involved a set of rules where two men would take turns shooting at each other. So if someone insulted your honor, you needed to challenge that person to a duel, and if you were challenged to a duel, you needed to accept. Now, dueling and this idea, this code of honor, that it was not limited to the South, and actually probably the most famous duel that took place around this time was between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, which has since been made into a musical, actually. So Hamilton was a senior aide to George Washington during the war, and then after the war he became the first Secretary of the Treasury. He was very influential in politics. He was one of the Federalists. And Hamilton thought that Burr, so Burr was also in politics, and Hamilton thought that Burr was in politics for selfish reasons. Recall that part of the idea, so one of the political ideas of the time is that being part of politics, you should not do that for selfish reasons. You shouldn't do that for your own self-aggrandizement. You shouldn't campaign. But politics was something you should do as a public service because you're called to do it. So Hamilton thought Burr was in politics for the wrong reasons, and he assisted in defeating Burr's bid for the presidency. When Burr wanted to run for president, Hamilton helped defeat him, and that was when instead Thomas Jefferson became president, and actually what happened is that Burr became vice president. So later then, Burr tried to run for governor of New York, and Hamilton again campaigned against him, and Burr lost. And now Burr believed that Hamilton had dishonored him by comments that Hamilton had made, like the typical types of harsh comments that politicians often make when they accuse each other of things. And Burr demanded that Hamilton apologize, and Hamilton would not apologize. So, to defend his honor, Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel. And to defend his honor, Hamilton had to accept. And so they had a duel, and Burr actually shot Hamilton, and shortly thereafter, Hamilton died from the wounds that he received from that duel. Another example of the type of violence that was common during this time involves a fight that broke out on the Senate floor. So the fight was between two senators. There was Senator Lyon, who was a middling class Republican. That is, he's someone that had to work to earn his money. He owned and operated several mills. And then the other senator was Senator Griswold, who was a Yale-educated Federalist from the elite class of people. And at one point, Senator Lyon spat on Senator Griswold. And then later, on the Senate floor, Griswold attacked Lyon with a cane and tried to beat him. And then Lyon grabbed a long pair of iron tongs from the fireplace and tried to defend himself. And the two people fought. And there was a big fight on the Senate floor. It is interesting to consider all the ways that life for the average person in the early 1800s was very different from life today. This was a time when most people spent all of their waking hours working, and most work was done on a farm or a plantation. One estimate is that maybe 80% of Americans worked on a farm. This was a time when shoes were expensive and many people went barefoot. A time when people rarely ever took a bath or bathed in any way. It was a time when it was common during winters for all members of a household to share beds together in a single room around a single fire. In the North, there was an increase in yeoman farmers. So this was kind of an ideal for what America should be. Many people thought our country should be a country of yeoman farmers. And a yeoman farmer was an approach to farming where you had a man who owned his small plot of land for a farm, where he lived with his wife and children, where he grew his own crops and raised his own animals. And that approach to farming was often called the yeoman farmer. It was also a time where the United States was very concentrated on the East Coast. So one estimate is that 2/3 of the population of the United States lived within 50 miles of the Atlantic coast. But there were the beginnings of the United States expanding westward. This was a time during this decade, the first decade of 1800, was when Lewis and Clark made their famous expedition to explore the West. And this blue line here shows the trail they took to explore the West, which at that point in history was largely unknown to white people. And through their journey, they crossed through many Native American nations and over the mountains of Idaho around here. They actually got stuck in the snow and emerged almost starving to death, but they were saved by the Nez Perce Native Americans in this area of the country who helped rescue them and helped them recuperate and gave them directions on how to follow the Columbia River to get to the West Coast. We will talk about the Nez Perce again later in our story, although that will not be a happy ending. It was also during the first decade of 1800 when the United States made the Louisiana Purchase, where we bought land from France. A large swath of land became part of the United States. Now, of course, this was a purchase that was made that both the United States and France thought that France had the right to sell this land to the United States. That land, of course, was occupied by many Native American nations who probably didn't agree that France had the right to sell the land to the United States. This is also a time when transportation was very difficult, and transportation over land was extremely difficult. So, for example, if you had a crop of tobacco, it was probably easier for you to transport it across the Atlantic Ocean on a ship propelled by wind than it was to transport it, say, 50 miles over land, which would require putting it on a wagon being pulled by a horse over primitive trails. So if you wanted to sell something to people beyond your immediate community, you needed to live near some kind of water passageway. So at this time, when people talked about the need for the country to build an infrastructure, what they were talking about usually was the need to build canals that could be used by boats for transportation. Actually, one of the main reasons that Lewis and Clark, one of the main reasons for their expedition was they were hoping to find a water passageway that could be used for transportation across the continent. Of course, they didn't find such a water passageway because that doesn't exist. So anyway, the first decade of 1800 is actually the time when steamboats first began to be used. And that was a key innovation at the time because it greatly improved the efficiency of transportation. Now, sometimes these steamboats still moved relatively slow. Maybe they were only going 6, 8, 12 miles an hour, but that still was a lot faster than other options available at the time. They were also somewhat dangerous. Steamboats had boilers that would sometimes explode and kill people. But still, this was an innovation that greatly improved transportation. Now, in the early 1800s, a few things happened that changed the nature of slavery in the United States. One of these things was that cotton became the primary crop that was grown in the South. There were a few reasons for this. One is that there was a worldwide demand for cotton, maybe similar to how there's been a worldwide demand for oil in recent times. At this point in history, cotton was the commodity that everybody wanted. And if you could sell cotton, you could make a lot of money at it. And also, they discovered that cotton could grow quite well in many parts of the South. And then also, Eli Whitney had developed the cotton gin in 1793, which was that machine that could separate the cotton seeds from the cotton fibers and made it easier to produce cotton. So they discovered in the South that by using slave labor as the primary method for producing cotton, cotton could be produced very cheaply. And therefore, it was highly profitable to use slaves to produce cotton. And cotton became the key industry, the key thing that drove the economy of the United States around this time in history. Here I have a picture that was drawn many years later, 1869, so this would even be after the Civil War. That was supposed to be a picture of the first cotton gin. Obviously, this would be another picture painted by a white person depicting slaves, because in this picture, these slaves look very happy using that cotton gin. I would imagine that if slaves were portraying their own experience, they might not make themselves look quite so happy. So the rise of cotton, that's one thing that happened. Another thing that happened is that in the United States, the import of slaves from Africa was banned. So at the time of the Constitution, it was legal to capture slaves in Africa and ship them over the ocean and sell them in the United States. So this law banned the import of slaves from Africa. Now, at first you might think, oh, isn't this a step in a good direction that we're banning the import of slaves from Africa? Well, not really, because the essential consequence of this law was that it now became very profitable in the United States to own and breed and raise slaves to sell. So the breeding and selling of slaves now became very profitable because now you didn't have to worry about competition from people selling slaves from Africa. So that made the breeding of slaves in the United States a more profitable business. And taken together, this essentially led to an entrenchment of pro-slavery viewpoints. I mentioned that prior to this time, people often thought of slavery in the United States as kind of this necessary evil. They didn't really want to get rid of it, but they didn't really think it was a good thing. But this led more and more, especially in the South, to a viewpoint that slavery was actually a good thing, it was necessary, and that it should never go away. So these events essentially led to the entrenchment of pro-slavery viewpoints in the South.
For cotton growing, a wailing mother.
And let's consider events that were taking place in Europe during the first decade of the 1800s, because these events will play an important role later on in our story. So recall that in France there was a revolution, and for a brief period of time there was a republic, but then Napoleon staged a coup and took over. And in 1804, Napoleon declared himself Emperor of France. And then there were a series of wars as Napoleon engaged in a military conquest trying to take over Europe. And this map here shows all the blue and purple areas is territory that was eventually conquered by Napoleon. And the key country at this point that then stood in Napoleon's way was the United Kingdom. And so this led to a war between France and England, between Napoleon and England. The French-English War began. Now, part of our story will involve the history of science and medicine. And this history will have some important lessons for us along the way. So, what was medical practice like during the first decade of the 1800s? And it's interesting to note that at this point in time, medical practice had not changed very much over the last 2,000 years or so, because for the most part, physicians still followed the teachings of the ancient Greek philosopher Hippocrates from about 2,000 years ago. And according to Hippocrates, sickness was caused by an imbalance of humors, or an imbalance of these bodily fluids. And Hippocrates thought that we had four basic humors, which were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And so the idea was that sickness was caused when there's an imbalance of these humors. So, for example, if you have too much yellow bile, that would make a person depressed. And given this theory, that meant that treatment involved methods for changing the balance of bodily fluids. And the most common treatment was bleeding, which was a common treatment that had been used for a couple thousand years at this point. And bleeding involved simply draining blood out of a person using a lancet or knives or scalpels or leeches sometimes, or cupping was another device. That's actually what is pictured on this page right here is a cupping set. It had some kind of a knife that would make a cut, and then the glass cup was placed over that, and I think they would pull that lever and it would make a vacuum and pull blood out of a person. So that was a cupping device. So bleeding was one of the most common treatments. Other methods might have included using laxatives or making a person vomit, some other methods they used. And so with this, we can consider the question, why is it that bloodletting persisted for so long as a common treatment? How is it that people didn't realize that this was actually harmful? Because not only are you draining blood out of a person, blood the person needs to be healthy, but beyond that, at this point, they didn't even have a concept of germ theory. And so physicians weren't cleaning their instruments or their knives or their scalpels or lancets. They would do bloodletting on one person. And if that person had a contagious disease, they were just transporting that disease from one person to the next. So it was certainly a very harmful practice. How is it that people went for so long without realizing how harmful this was? Obviously, they weren't stupid because, people haven't evolved quickly to change our level of intelligence. So people were just as intelligent then as they are now. And certainly these are people that probably cared about the patients they were treating. So these were intelligent people. These were people that cared about their patients. How did they not realize that they were actually harming them? And I think the key lesson we learned from this is that physicians or practitioners or clinicians are not good about judging the effectiveness of their own treatment. And we know this about human nature, that humans, we naturally tend to perceive and notice things that fit with what we believe is true, and we tend not to notice things that would go against what we think is really true. And so if you're a practitioner, you believe your treatment is effective, you want it to be effective, and if you're a human being, you're naturally going to notice things that suggest your treatment's effective, and you're going to fail to notice things that might indicate your treatment's not effective. And this is an important lesson for us today, because if you're a practitioner today and think that you can make a valid judgment about the effectiveness of your own treatment, you're probably going to be wrong, and you're running the same risks that people made for thousands of years of thinking bloodletting was effective, because they were convinced they could evaluate the effectiveness of their own treatments, and they were certain that their treatment was effective. So the key lesson we learn here is that practitioners are probably not good judges of the effectiveness of their own treatments. Now, in addition to Hippocrates and bloodletting, another part of medical theory at this time in history was the miasma theory. And miasma theory was the idea that disease is caused by breathing bad air, like bad air from things that rot or smell bad. In fact, actually, some of the concern around this point in history was that when white people in Europe looked at the Americas and saw the Native Americans there, they thought the Native Americans seemed like a primitive society. They seemed like savages, and so they thought, well, maybe the Americas have bad air, and that caused the people there to be savages. And people in the United States, in fact, Thomas Jefferson, he actually wanted to find evidence to show that the Native Americans had more advanced societies to help prove that the air on this continent really wasn't bad air after all. So people were often concerned about air, and sometimes treatments involved, if you were wealthy enough, they might say, well, if you're in the Americas and you're sick, it might be from breathing bad air here. Maybe if you go to Europe, or maybe just another part of the country where they have good air, that would be a good way to recover. So miasma theory focused on the idea that maybe there's good air and bad air, and that bad air is caused by breathing things like from things that rot or smell bad, and that's one of the key causes of disease. There are many other ways that medical practice at this time in history was different from today. Surgeries like amputations would have been performed without anesthesia and without antisepsis. That is, they wouldn't have kept their instruments clean. And so a surgery would have been not only incredibly painful, but a lot of times it led to an infection, and a lot of times these infections were fatal. Here I have a picture of some surgical instruments used for amputation around this time in history. This is also a time when epidemics and fatal diseases were very common, and doctors lacked understanding of what caused these diseases, and they lacked effective treatments for them. So, for example, yellow fever there were several yellow fever epidemics around this time. We know now that yellow fever spread by mosquitoes. They didn't know that then. Malaria was common in many parts of the South. There were epidemics of cholera. Now we know that's a disease caused by bacteria when people drink drinking water contaminated with fecal material. They didn't know that then. Tuberculosis was also very common and killed a lot of people. And at this point in history, a hospital was not a place you would want to go. A hospital was more a place just to house poor people who were sick. They often had terrible conditions, and was often just a place where people went to die. So a hospital was not a pleasant place and not really a helpful place at this time in history. So this was not a time in history when you wanted to be a medical patient. Now, it was around this time, at the beginning of the 1800s, in the United States, when a man by the name of Benjamin Rush was working on treatments for people with what today we would call mental illness. In Philadelphia, he was a physician in Philadelphia, and he established what he called a wing for the insane at a hospital in Philadelphia. And for his work, he is often regarded as the father of American psychiatry. Now, they would not have used psychiatry at this point in history, but psychiatry would be, a psychiatrist would be a medical doctor that provides treatments for people with mental illness. And Benjamin Rush, so he was a physician, a medical doctor, and he thought that mental illness, or what at that time he would have used the word insanity, but he thought that it was a physiological disease, and that was how he looked at it. And he liked the moral therapy movement that was going on in Europe. So he was influenced by that moral therapy movement. And he agreed with the idea that people with what he would have called insanity, or today mental illness, that people need humane, kind, compassionate treatment. And he wanted to promote the idea of building asylums where this type of kind, compassionate, humane treatment could be provided. Notably, he also believed in bloodletting, which he was a physician, and that was a common thing for physicians to do at this time in history. And so he treated mental illness, among other things. He used bloodletting as one of his treatments for people with mental illness. It was also a treatment he used on himself. For example, there's one point in his life where he was very ill, and he told his attending physicians to bleed me liberally because he thought that would help cure him. And actually, interestingly, there was actually one point where a journalist wrote an article in a paper that was critical of bloodletting and raising questions about whether bloodletting was actually effective. And Benjamin Rush actually sued the journalist for libel for claiming such bad things about bloodletting. And Benjamin Rush actually won the lawsuit. So, although he was in favor of humane treatment, he also used bloodletting, which, as we know now, wasn't such a good idea. And he also did use some other treatments that probably were not effective. Some types of treatments involved essentially nearly drowning patients or twirling them around really fast or whirling them around really fast. He used some treatments that were just kind of trying to frighten patients, thinking that would help them. So he had actually several other unconventional types of treatments that he tried, which probably none of those were very effective. Now, Benjamin Rush is important for our story, not only because he's typically regarded as the father of American psychiatry, but also because at this time in history, he was probably the most prominent American abolitionist. That is, he was opposed to slavery and very vocal about his opposition. Now, as we'll see shortly, just because he was opposed to slavery doesn't mean that he also didn't have some very racist ideas. But in 1793, that's right before the decade of 1800, he organized the American Convention for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. Now, this wasn't a very big group. At this point in history, there were not that many abolitionists. Not too many people were opposed to slavery. But of that small group of people who were opposed to slavery, Benjamin Rush was certainly a leader. Now, his approach here would fit our definition of racism as an assimilationist type of racism. That is, his viewpoint was not that black people and white people were equal. He saw black people as inferior to white people, but thought that one day they could be equal. And that was his reason for wanting to abolish slavery. And specifically, he had a viewpoint that suggested that, well, he thought that black people suffered from a kind of disease that made them black. And so he talked about black people having this disease that had black skin and involved what he used the term, he called it woolly heads, and laziness and hypersexuality and pain insensitivity, which, note, that's actually some of the same things that Thomas Jefferson accused slaves and black people of being. So he had some of those same stereotypes, racist stereotypes of black people, and he thought that a disease caused that. But his idea was that if black people would be freed from slavery, if we stopped slavery, then they'd be able to recover from this disease, and then they'd become more like white people, and then there could be equality among the races. So he had the assimilationist, racist point of view that led him to be an abolitionist opposed to slavery. So I mentioned that Benjamin Rush was interested in the new moral therapy movement, but he wasn't the only person in the United States interested in this new approach to treatment. There was actually a growing movement in the United States at this time, at the beginning of the 1800s, that could be called the Asylum Movement. And the asylum movement was comprised of people that liked the idea of moral therapy, and they wanted to build asylums in the United States, which would be places where people with what today we would call mental illness, or they called insanity, where these people could go and received kind, compassionate care, like the moral therapy proposed. And one of the very first asylums that was built in the United States is a place called the Friends Asylum in Philadelphia. And I believe Friends Asylum is still there. I have on this page an old picture of the Friends Asylum and a more contemporary picture of the Friends Asylum. And if you notice the name of this asylum, Friends, that probably gives you a clue where this idea came from. Because when I was talking about William Tuke and the York Retreat in England, recall that William Tuke was a Quaker and that Quakers called each other friends. And indeed, the Friends Asylum is an institution that was built by Quakers, and they sought to model their asylum off of William Tuke's retreat in England. And they wanted to provide that new moral therapy. So it included, what do they do in their asylum? So they did things like maybe they'd have patients that could exercise, they did painting, they did gardening, they did writing, carpentry, music. I think they gave them some kind of lessons on good hygiene. And a lot of these treatments, in one way or another, often involved some type of religious training that people got as well. Notably, in addition to the moral therapy treatments, they sometimes did other treatments, just like Benjamin Rush did. You might find them actually doing bloodletting in some of these asylums. Or other treatments might be like cold baths. If you douse someone in cold water, maybe that will help them. They also used laxatives, and opium and morphine were also sometimes used. So again, a wide variety of treatments. But the goal was to use the kind, compassionate care proposed by moral therapy. Now, initially, these asylums were all very small institutions. Maybe a typical asylum might have about 50 patients in it. And the person in charge of the asylum would be a physician who would be called the physician superintendent that would be in charge of the asylum. And given that the asylum's small with only 50 patients or so, that physician superintendent could very easily know all the patients in the asylum. Now, the asylum movement was based on a good idea. The idea was to provide kind, compassionate care. The idea was that the asylums weren't that large, but it didn't actually work out so well in the long run. As you might guess, a lot of these treatments weren't very effective. And what happened over time is that asylums grew in size, and over the next several decades, they got bigger and bigger. In fact, by the time we get to the end, like the late 1870s, late 1880s, and around 1900, asylums get to be where they have 500 people in them or more. So these grow into very large, inhumane places for treatment, but the initial idea was something very positive.